of a Community Resilience Handbook for Disaster Preparedness and Management. The second segment is the panel discussion on Community-Based Disaster Risk Mitigation. The panel discussion will feature some of the globally well-known experts in the field of disaster management. This Community Resilience Handbook for Disaster Preparedness and Management is prepared with inputs from the America with Kerala project, with which many of you are familiar. Today is a landmark day. It is the culmination of this campaign, which was jointly organized from June to October 2019 by the U.S. Consulate General in Chennai and the Center for Public Policy Research, CPPR, in Kochi, Kerala, and the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority. This 5-month initiative promoted an all hazards approach, specifically addressing the 4 phases of a disaster management cycle, including mitigation and prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. Many of you have been a part of the America with Kerala campaign in different roles, as experts, as resource persons, as project partners, and participants. I want to thank in particular my colleague Biju Kumar at the Consulate for his very excellent work on this project and bringing it to fruition. I especially also want to thank our implementing partners at the Center for Public Policy Research and the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority, without whom we could not have completed this project. I also want to thank our panelists in advance for their valuable time and expertise in today's program. A hearty welcome to you all. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Lee Sashadry. She is the Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Chennai. She previously served as a Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Toronto, Canada. She has also served overseas in Thailand as the Cultural Affairs Officer and as the American Center Director in New Delhi, India. She served as a Vice Consul in Chennai during her first overseas assignment with the American Foreign Service. She holds an MA in Development Communications and a BA in Political Science. She is the recipient of several State Department honors and is an alumna of the Boren National Security Education Scholarship. Anne is a native of New Hampshire. Anne, may I request you to make remarks and to formally launch the Community Resilience Handbook for Disaster Preparedness and Management. Anne, over to you.
Thank you, Mulik. Greetings, Vanakkam, Namaskaram. Dr. Haran, Dr. Thummarukudy, Dr. Grover, Dr. Kuriakose, Dr. Dhanuraj, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining us today as we release the Community Resilience Handbook for Disaster Preparedness. More than ever before, it is important that we recognize the pressing challenges posed by human-made and natural disasters around the world. The frequency of disasters have increased in recent decades, and they have become more significant, both in terms of magnitude and numbers. Given the huge scale of these disasters, it is more important than ever to look for ways to address these crises and respond in effective, efficient, and comprehensive ways. As the whole world fights COVID-19, building preparedness and resilience has become particularly significant. Let me tell you a little bit about the United States. As you know, our country is vulnerable to natural disasters. In fact, every one of our 50 states is exposed to one or more of a host of hazards, to include earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanoes, and wildfires. And I'm sure many Indians watched as wildfires raged in our West just recently, and as hurricanes ravaged the southeast of our country. According to the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, which we call FEMA, the US government responds to at least one natural disaster or emergency each week. In 2019, they responded to over 90 natural disasters. In our country, as in India, the burden for relief falls primarily on state and local governments. However, when needs exceed a state's capacity, the governor may ask for federal assistance. And FEMA, as I mentioned, is the primary agency responsible for coordinating Washington's disaster relief efforts and recovery within the United States. When major disasters strike abroad, the US lends a hand as requested by host country government. This happens primarily through the US Agency for International Development, or USAID. Here in the Indo-Pacific, we find ourselves in the most disaster-prone region of the world. The death toll far exceeds that of other regions in the world when it comes to natural disasters. Now let me come to the America with Kerala project. As my colleague Maulik mentioned earlier, we are releasing the Community Resilience Handbook, which is a key outcome of this project. This project started in response to Kerala's destructive floods of 2018. At that time, the whole world applauded the resilience and the determination with which the government and people of Kerala managed the floods, which I know were the worst in over 100 years. Unfortunately, disaster struck Kerala again with heavy rains and landslides in August 2019. But in the wake of each crisis, the people of Kerala stood together, hand in hand, above considerations of their differences, to overcome nature's fury. The international community, including thousands of Americans, stepped up and contributed to disaster relief and reconstruction efforts. The Kerala diaspora population in the United States also contributed. Others include Indian alums of our US government exchange programs, American businesses in Kerala, and American citizens in Kerala were actively involved in recovery and rehabilitation efforts. They leveraged their expertise and leadership in the spirit of volunteerism and giving back to their communities. The America with Kerala project was planned to build. This project was designed to share best practices from the US experience with relevant agencies and stakeholders in Kerala, while providing an opportunity for US experts to learn from Kerala's experience managing the flooding. This project involved a series of awareness building events, such as meetings, workshops, media engagements, and interactive programs focused on disaster preparedness, management, and resiliency, and covered 3 major cities of Kerala. The first round of workshops took place in Trivandrum, and it is there that we ideated the development of a university-level disaster management curriculum. We have with us today Dr. Himanshu Grover from the University of Washington. He was present in that curriculum development workshop and guided our focus group discussions. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Grover. With inputs from that first workshop, Dr. Grover is currently developing a 40-hour elective course that can be incorporated into existing academic programs for universities, autonomous colleges, and other relevant government and non-government agencies. The curriculum that he develops will employ an all-hazards approach, and it will be broadly applicable beyond even the specific focus of Kerala. This curriculum will be another concrete outcome of the America with Kerala project. We will present this curriculum to Ministries of Higher Education, state higher education councils, university administrators, disaster management authorities, and others. The second round of America with Kerala workshop took place in Kochi, and that focused on disaster resilient urban development and policy planning. And the third workshop took place in Kozhikode, or Calicut, and that focused on community empowerment. That workshop solicited ideas toward the development of a community resource guide that would come out in both English and Malayalam. And I want to thank Dr. Dhanuraj and his team at the Center for Public Policy Research, who have done an excellent job in assembling recommendations and key points from those discussions and compiling them in the form of a handbook. This resource guide includes recommendations and inputs from grassroots community leaders who led on-the-ground disaster during the 2018 and 2019 floods in Kerala. It also includes input from US and Indian experts on disaster management and other relevant sources, including the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority and the National Disaster Management Authority. It is my proud privilege to present to all of you this Community Resilience Handbook for Disaster Preparedness and Management. I hope this handbook will come in handy for all of you as you prepare for whatever disasters might lie ahead. And I hope that the outcomes of the Americas with Kerala project will continue to contribute to the advancement of US-India ties and collaborations in the area of disaster management, as well as to support the Rebuild Kerala initiative. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for launching that handbook. That's very exciting. I would now like to turn to the second part of today's program, which is a panel discussion. I will go ahead and introduce the panelists and our moderator. The first panelist is Dr. Nevadita Haran, IAS retired. Dr. Haran retired as the Additional Chief Secretary, Department of Home Affairs from the Government of Kerala, and has served extensively in various capacities with the Government of Kerala, as well as the Government of India. She was also the Civil Affairs Officer for the UN Peacekeeping Mission in Kosovo for 5 years. Dr. Haran has worked through the ranks of the Indian Administrative Service, leading home, revenue, land management, energy, and institutional capacity building initiatives in Kerala. She brought up the Disaster Management Department with the Hazard, Vulnerability, and Risk Assessment Cell and the State Disaster Management Authority in Kerala. She serves as the Honorary Chairperson of the Board of Directors at the Center for Migration and Inclusive Development. Dr. Haran, welcome. Dr. Muralee Thummarukudy is currently the Global Chief of Disaster Risk Reduction and Operations at the United Nations Environment Program, UN Environment. He has over 25 years of experience in environment and disaster management around the world. As Operations Manager for Post-Conflict and Disaster Management Branch, Dr. Muralee coordinated projects ranging from assessment to capacity building and cleanup all over the world. Since 2009, Dr. Muralee focuses his work on disaster risk reduction and is engaged in global advocacy for factoring in ecosystems into natural disaster risk reduction strategies. He plays a leading role in the Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction. Thank you, sir. We're very grateful you could join us today. Our third panelist is Dr. Shekhar Kuriakose. Dr. Shekhar is the Member Secretary of the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority, ex officio. He contributed to the preparation and completion of Kerala's first disaster management plan in 2016. He led the establishment of the State Emergency Operations Center of KSDMA and is now the head scientist at the Kerala State Emergency Operations Center. In 2018, he participated in the US State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program, an exchange program that was focused on building resilience to environmental challenges. Our fourth panelist is joining us all the way from Seattle, Washington. Dr. Himanshu Grover is the co-director of the Institute for Hazard Mitigation and Planning at the College of Built Environment at the University of Washington in Seattle. He is also an assistant professor of urban design and planning at the same institution. His research emphasizes place-based planning policies to balance economic, environmental, and social priorities to achieve equitable development and to enhance community resilience. He was one of the US experts at the America with Kerala workshops in Trivandrum and Kochi. Dr. Grover, thank you very much for joining us from afar. Finally, our moderator for this session will be Dr. D. Dhanuraj. Dr. Dhanuraj is the chairman of the Board of Trustees and the chief executive of the Center for Public Policy and Research in Kochi, Kerala, of which he is also one of the founding members. He holds a PhD in Science and Humanities from Anna University, an MSc in Physics from Mahatma Gandhi University, and an MA in Political Science from Madras Christian College. His core areas of expertise include urbanization, urban transport and infrastructure, education, health, livelihood, law, and election analysis. Dr. Dhanuraj will be the moderator of this panel discussion on community-based disaster risk mitigation. And Dr. Dhanuraj, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank you very much for your hard work on America with Kerala. You were an excellent partner for the consulate, and we were very grateful to work with you. Dr. Dhanuraj, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Muralee, for the kind words and also giving us this opportunity to work with US Consulate General Chennai to understand the disaster preparedness and management risk reduction in the state of Kerala. We had excellent time working with experts from all over the world. We had great occasions where we were able to interact with local stakeholders, and all the 3 workshops that we have conducted, Trivandrum, Kochi, and Kozhikode, it received good attention from all the participants. They were very much involved, and I'm sure the handbook that is released today is a very good outcome, the expected deliverable from these workshops that we organized as part of America with Kerala. I also take this opportunity to really, show you the audience. There is a Malayalam version for this book that is released today. It's called Durandangal Thayyareduppalum Neridalum. This is the Malayalam version, so this will also be available in the public domain. And in fact, we sought guidance and support from Kerala State Disaster Management Authority to prepare this book. This is I don't call it as the expert book. This is the compilation of the discussions and debates that we had in these 3 workshops and also in consultation with Disaster Management Authority. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. Now, coming to the panel discussion today, I think we have got only limited time, about half an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience present today. I start with, this is going to be a conversation more. So I start by asking a question to Dr. Muralee Thummarukudy. Sir, I remember reading your articles. I remember watching some of your television shows. In 2016-17 time, you in fact, you had a forecast. Kerala is going to have a flood, and sooner than later, unfortunate for us, it occurred in 2018. And you've seen the pre-flood time. You also been part of the government machinery, advising Kerala government on how to approach, how to prepare for these disasters in future. So from your international experience, I would like to know from you, what has been your experience? What is your understanding about the disaster preparedness for the state of Kerala now, having seen 2 floods, and now we are in this pandemic time globally, not only in Kerala. So what is your experience in Kerala working on disaster related issues?
Thank you, Dr. Dhanuraj. I want to start by thanking the US Consulate General for inviting me to the session, but also even more importantly, supporting Kerala during the flood 2018, and also a series of actions which follow from it. The work which Dr. Grover is now undertaking, if embedded into our universities, it will have long and lasting impact on creating a new generation of students. And I'm also very delighted to be sharing this panel with Dr. Niveditha Haran, who initiated the work which laid the foundation of the State Disaster Management Authority, and with Dr. Shekhar, with whom I'm almost in a regular touch. So it's indeed really a pleasure to be in this panel. Now, coming to your question about Kerala's preparedness, I have actually been speaking about the possibility of a flood since 2013, actually, since the time of the Uttarakhand flood. And it is pretty much obvious that Kerala is going to have a flood, and the boundaries of those floods were actually known, and we had discussed at many levels. We had a major event, I think in 2013. Shekhar can verify the date. It was called Surakshayanam. Dr. Nevadita Haran was in charge of the Revenue and Disaster Management Department at that time, and we had a global audience of experts and audience coming in for that. In 2017, I had an opportunity to talk to the members of the Legislative Assembly in Kerala, and also made the same point. And it is not that the government did not do anything. The things were being put in place. The State Disaster Management Authority is very young, and this is also one of the most dynamic and active disaster management authorities, which I'm actually very, very proud of. So the things were being put in place, but the events overtook us, and we know what happened. Now, since then, a lot has happened. And I am probably taking few things out of what Shekhar should be saying, but so therefore I will only say what I have seen and I'm proud of, and Shekhar can elaborate on it. The first and the most important thing which we learned is that during a disaster, it is not the UN or the Disaster Management Authority or anybody who save most people. Most people are saved by their family members and their neighbors and their community. So therefore, number one investment has to be in the family and community in terms of raising awareness and capacity. And the State Disaster Management Authority, working with a number of actors, have now put together a massive set of volunteers, almost 300,000, almost one volunteer per 100 population, which and they are being trained electronically. Second thing is that every panchayat now have a disaster management plan at a very, very local level. And that, I think, is going to eventually be tremendously helpful. Thirdly, climate change and disaster management is being integrated into one of the standing items in the local self-government budget. So these three elements put together on one side, empowering the community with knowledge, with resources, with roles, would make significant difference in due course in the landscape of disaster management in Kerala. And I will just conclude by saying that this is indeed the global best practice. We should not be depending upon people coming in by helicopters or airplanes from outside. We will certainly need them in some context, in some extreme context, some acute situation. But 99.9% of our rescue, of our relief, of our recovery must happen at the local level. And I think Kerala is a good model. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thummarukudy. In fact, I should also take this opportunity to acknowledge your support and guidance during our America with Kerala workshop. In fact, you had introduced our team to Ms. Karen Rex. She's also part of UN risk reduction force. And we had a few meetings with her in Trivandrum when she visited Kerala last year. So her contribution is also there in this handbook that we released today. Thank you so much. Ma'am, Niveditha, ma'am, I know you had extensively researched on disaster management in India. You have some publications, you have written books, and you're also the Principal Secretary, Revenue, Land, then Disaster Management was set up during your time. So my question to you is, since Kerala floods in 2018, a lot of talk about development, there is a lot of talk about land utilization, a lot of talk about revenue, revenue flow, and then how the development paradigm is in fact resulting in some of the disasters. Could you share some experience? Could you give some insights? Because you were in charge of many of these departments in your career. So could you give some insightful thoughts on this discussion that is happening in Kerala?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Taking the cue from Dr. Muralee, let me thank the US Consulate and CPPR for inviting me for this discussion. I would definitely, it'll be a pleasure to share my ideas with all of you. Actually, I was not part of the administration when the Kerala floods of 2018 happened. I had retired before that. But on what had been done and what was the setup in the disaster management department and how it impacted on governance, let me share a bit of my ideas with you, what happened and what we learned from them. Yes, I was in charge of disaster management in Kerala for almost 6.5 years. And actually my friends and colleagues used to joke that disaster management, which nobody ever thought would be a department, had been made into a very glamorous department. So I used to tell them that, look, this is a department which will be probably one of the most important ones in the future. And I think that forecast is coming true. Now, Kerala was one of the first amongst the states to set up its disaster management authority. Kerala was also, very hearteningly, one of the first states to reach out to the community level. And you all know that the local bodies are extremely active and strong in Kerala. And that helped. And the comparison that I make now, seeing other states, I will presently come back to that. But some of the things that I would like to share is the importance of scientific data and empirical data. I think that was one thing that we started doing, collecting data, collecting information, analyzing it, and ensuring that policy is made, policy decisions are taken on the basis of such data, which is extremely important. Unless one does that, I think one is kind of groping in the dark. The other thing that I would like to mention is, especially in modern times, we are lucky to be living in times where there is the social media. It's such an immense globalization that we can share information so quickly, which was not there 100 years back when the Spanish flu happened, for instance. But use of ICT and use of social media in an effective manner, we realized how important it was. Not only as far as reaching out to the last mile, but also to ensure that we get information from the last mile, which often does not happen. And that was another thing that we learned, and we tried to incorporate in all our planning. The other thing that is also very important, and which I cannot but mention, is that any mitigative measure, as Dr. Muralee also mentioned, can happen only when it starts at the local level. And there, I think we did some good job. And perhaps that has been built upon and has been taken much, much ahead. So whether it is empowering them with a knowledge base, whether it is ensuring that the required equipments are available, all these are so important when you come to the level of the village officer and the panchayat, which are the cutting edge level officials and officers in any state in India. And that we managed to do. I remember something, I'm not sure whether it's still continuing, but we set up these task forces. So at every panchayat level or in a group of panchayats, we had these task forces which consisted of 8 to 10 persons, local persons, who would volunteer to help the other authorities when a disaster happened. So we had from the local area, the local headmaster, the schoolmaster, teacher, the nurse, the local driver, any kind of person, any person who had some kind of a capacity, or even if he did not have, he had the desire to do something, we enrolled them into these task forces. And these task forces actually functioned as the eyes and ears of the district collectors in the future. And I was extremely happy to hear when the pandemic struck, a collector who was working with me at that point of time called me up and said, "Madam, the task forces we have now revived and they are doing such excellent work." And they combined it very well with the ASHA workers. They brought in the ASHA workers, and that made it, they become such a potent group to speak to the government, to ensure that they reach out to the people who are actually affected on the ground, and to ensure that the words and grievances of these people are reached to the higher levels from where then they can be assisted. The other point I want to mention, which we also learned and which I have to mention, is the importance of leadership. And I'm not talking about leadership at a high level. I'm talking about the local level leadership. I have found that wherever the leadership is active, is sensitive, the response to disasters has been excellent. And I say that whether it is Bali village in West Bengal, or Srinagar floods in 2014 in Jammu and Kashmir, wherever the local leaders have stood up and come forward to take the leadership, things have worked well. And many of the cases, very hearteningly, and I felt very happy when I see that, it's been the youngsters who have come forward to take the leadership and the lead. The other point I have to mention finally is that something which in the case of Kerala, we are extremely sensitive to, and I now try to ensure that other states where I'm involved also get, if not as much, even more sensitivity towards it, is the requirement of a gender balance. It may sound a bit offhand, but I have seen, and I can at any point give data and information on that, wherever the women come forward and become part of either knowledge building, empowering, or when they have to respond to a disaster, the work has always been extremely effective. And I say this, and I want to end by giving a couple of examples. I remember when we had gone, I had gone with my team to Bali village. Bali is a small village in Sundarbans in West Bengal. The woman there asked me that if this kind of a flood that has happened, the cyclone followed by the flood, if this kind of a flood happens again, what will happen? Are we prepared for it? This kind of question was not asked by either the panchayat president or the men around. So she was thinking ahead and planning that if I rebuild my house at this point again, at this spot again, will I again be affected by the cyclone and the floods that come with it, the high tides which come with it? And more important, as she was talking to me, her mother-in-law came outside from inside the house and asked me, look, daughter, you know, something that you need to do is stop people from destroying the mangroves. I was amazed. This kind of a reaction, this kind of a response, I had not got it from any of the men with whom we were dealing, we were talking. And finally, in Srinagar, post-floods, when we talked to the people there, and we were, you know, the reconstruction and all that was happening, it was the woman who asked me that, please make sure that we have an alternate source of employment, alternate source of income. Because once the flood happened, everything was washed away. And for almost 2.5 years, we had no income. And we were living hand to mouth on the government benefits that were coming. I don't want that to happen again. Please help me to do anything that will help me to earn a living for my family. You know, this kind of response shows that we need to bring the women folk together. We need to ensure that they come and give their responses in a manner that we incorporate that in our policy. And these are some things which in Kerala, I have to say, the Kudumbashree groups, the self-help groups have been extremely relevant and responsive. And it happened even post-floods of 2018. And that is something that we need to really keep in mind when we talk of any response and mitigative measures post-disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that's true for, the women leaders taking a lead is true in this pandemic time also. I think a lot of studies coming out, whether it's in New Zealand or in Finland, prime ministers, women prime ministers are taking a lead in containing this COVID virus. I think I'll get back to you in the next round about the revenue land, because you also handle those departments, because this is a point of contention in Kerala. You know, in our all the workshops that we had conducted, this was one of the key discussion point. Participants raised this issue. I'm sure you will be able to share some insights on those also. Coming to Dr. Grover. Dr. Grover, you were in Kerala for 2 workshops, and you also had the opportunity to go to some of the leading universities of Kerala. You interact with students, you interact with the faculty there, and you have that global experience to give some insights. I'm sure, I know many students are attending this event now. Many are watching us discussing these issues, and some of the faculty members who were present in our workshop, they also joined this panel discussion. In these 2 workshops, in those 2 workshops that you had attended, you talked about the role of academic institutions, and now Niveditha ma'am also talked about scientific and empirical evidence, and you talked a lot about geospatial data is used in US, and your university, your department is taking a lead in those interventions, and you are guiding, supporting, and advising the local authorities. And since you have Indian origin also, this is a time of discussing Indian Americans, the capacity of Indian institutions, the strength of Indian institutions. And you also seen how Kerala is different from the rest of the country in terms of having that collaborative approach at the ground level. So and you are now preparing course, we are going to submit it to Kerala's Higher Education Department and Ministry. So what do you suggest to the students and professors present here? How could they contribute? How can they contribute to the debates and discussions, and even including awareness creation, other than in addition to the scientific and empirical research they could do on disasters and probably forecasting, predicting what is going to happen next few years?
Thank you, Dhanuraj, for your question. Let me also thank the hosts for inviting all of us here. I mean, you've assembled a very experienced panel, and I'm delighted to share the stage with the other colleagues who have extensive experience in the field. And Dhanuraj, like you mentioned, yes, academia does have a major role to play. Like we've talked about, like Niveditha ma'am was saying about having risk analysis, generating the scientific data sets, because unless we have true analysis of the risk, we will not be able to respond to it effectively. And then Dr. Muralee was talking about enhancing capacities at the local level, people being able to have the tools and the knowledge and the background to adapt and to respond to these kinds of challenges, academia can play a major role in training, building that capacity. One of the major things that I think, especially in the Indian context, is that we do have, and especially in Kerala, that I saw the amount of civic capacity that people came to help out each other and everything, and the way the floods impact would have been much worse had the people not kind of come together and responded the way they helped out each other. So I think that is something we can build upon. The problem usually comes is that the disaster memory kind of fades away. So these people will kind of forget what they did. And if we don't have few disasters for a few years, people will forget how they responded, things were needed. So in this context, especially academia can play as an important role as providing that, documenting the adaptive framework and kind of perpetuating that across generations and across different fields so that everybody kind of understands, see, this is how we did, this is the way it should be done, and this is how we could have saved more lives or saved more property. Another important, I think, the role for academia is to start thinking about resilience and disaster response in a broader context. It's not a separate academic discipline or a separate field. I mean, come to think of it, disasters are not caused by any kind of extreme natural events. They're caused by humans occupying the space where extreme natural events, as it is occur, it's part of the natural cycle. We have infringed upon the natural systems and therefore we're facing the impacts. So especially in academia, we should be able to train students to think beyond just the basic, cost benefit analysis, which is in economic terms, but also look at in terms of risk exposure, look at in terms of our environmental services that we impact, how a certain kind of a development can have impact beyond just the local landscape, how it can result in increased flooding, can increase and increased runoff, can maybe make destabilize the local ecosystem. So those kind of things can really be done. And finally, I think the mere fact by discussing and bringing attention to disasters and the challenges that they bring, we are humans are all rational beings. So, I mean, I think people, the people who kind of work in the universities or in the education institutions, the students, just by being aware of the challenges that exist would itself make them kind of look for avenues and opportunities to build capacity and resilience within their own families and their extended networks, which will be extremely useful. Just they all would know, oh, it can strike anytime, we should have emergency kit, we should have certain water store or things like that. So those kind of capacity can go a long way in minimizing the negative impacts of disaster events.
Thank you, Dr. Grover. I'm told that Dr. Kuriakose is on another call. So by the time he joins back to the panel, I'll ask him the question. Dr. Muralee, you have global experience. You've been working in this field for the last 2-3 decades now. What is your advice to the state in terms of strengthening our institutions to help them or to equip them in managing and mitigating the disasters? I mean, my question is very particular in terms of, are we still missing any institutional mechanism? Or do we need to create more institutional mechanisms? Or the strategy should be to strengthen the existing institutions?
Thank you, Dr. Dhanuraj. In my opinion, the institution architecture is already there, and that's really not the main constraint. The information is also very much there, but our main challenge is a lack of focus. We start to think about flood when we have a flood. Then we start to think of landslide when we have a landslide. And then for months together, we go after it. You have a boat sinking in Thekadi. Next 3 weeks, you are going after every boat in the state trying to fix boats. And then you have a firecracker happening in a temple, then 3 weeks, everyone is after the firecracker. But that's not how you should be dealing with disasters. An all hazard approach, which Anne mentioned in the beginning. The hazards are there. Now we have hundreds of high-rise buildings coming up in Kerala. The day before yesterday, I was talking to firemen in Kerala. They said only in Kannur and Kasaragod they have more than 100 high-rise buildings. And when I look at Kerala, there will be a fire in a high-rise building, and many people will die. More than a dozen people will die for sure, because it has happened in Dubai. Grenfell Tower happened in London, which had fire service for last 400 years. Happens in Hong Kong, happened in Mumbai, happened in Coimbatore. There's no reason why it would not happen in Kerala. But we are not there yet. We are just waiting for that to happen. And then, of course, we'll start to pay attention to it. And I can name a number of other things, the oil spills, which could happen along the Kerala coast and so on and so forth. So the key is not to focus attention on the last disaster, but to focus on the next one, the one which is going to come. The institutional machinery is all there. The people are there, but spread your eyes, learn from other people's experience at all times. We had 2 disasters the last 2 months. We had the ship Wakashio, which hit a reef and broke into 2 in Mauritius. What do we learn from that? We had a massive explosion in a port in Beirut, which dislocated 500,000 people out of their house within few minutes. What do we learn from that? So don't wait for those disasters to come to Kerala. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shekhar?
Yes, Dhanuraj, sir, I am here.
Yes.
I'm very sorry that I had to break a bit.
Fine. So we were, I don't know whether you were able to listen to other panelists, but anyway, KSDMA has got a bigger mandate. I mean, I think in our personal conversations also during the last 1 year, we were discussing the role of KSDMA in coordination and then effectively implementing some of the systems and practices globally accepted or in the customized version of Kerala, in the state of Kerala. That is what KSDMA is expected to do. So my question to you would be on the role of KSDMA in policy making, formulation, coordination with the different departments, and effective communication. I quite often hear KSDMA comes on radio, television channels, discussing, alerting people on about the rains and all. So how can we improve from here?
Thank you. It's pretty a broad question. Well, you have touched upon every aspect of governance, which I am rather a novice still with 10 years. My first boss and whoever taught me what governance should be is already on the panel. So I am less experienced than her to even comment on how we would be working with our tentacles into everything. But what we have done, I will be able to tell you. And probably that's based on what Madam had set us as a path for us to work on. SDMA works very closely with all the departments in the state, and more so since 2016. We ever since the state disaster management plan was approved. Now, one of the things, one example from the plan will tell you how we work with ensuring disaster risk reduction, which is very important, as that we have mentioned landslides a while ago. In the state plan, it is mentioned that in the high hazard zones of Kerala, you can't have blasting type of quarrying conducted. And this was taken on to the Honorable High Court, deliberated upon, and in Kerala now, the High Court has also decreed that the state plan holds good as a subordinate legislation, which cannot be bypassed by any other act or law or rules in the state, and that you can't have blasting type of quarrying in high hazard zones of Kerala. So this is one intervention that KSDMA did in 2016, and it stands good even now. And it has been tested in the judiciary time and again, and we have succeeded in upholding that particular decision. A second initiative that I could mention in terms of how we entered into environmental protection is the Honorable High Court had once suggested to us in a very famous case called T. N. Makar case that KSDMA should consider directing the local self-government to ensure that rivulets and streams of Kerala are not obstructed when new buildings are constructed. So under section 69 of the Disaster Management Act, SDMA in 2017 gave a direction to the local self-government stating that this amendment has to come in the act. And interestingly, disaster management authorities can direct governments to amend rules or acts to ensure disaster risk reduction. And this is the specific power that was utilized by SDMA. And 2019 Kerala Municipal Building Rules and Kerala Panchayat Building Rules has this explicitly stated that if you obstruct your building shall not obstruct a natural stream or a rivulet, and if you do so, you are penalized under, you will be punishable under section 50 of the Disaster Management Act, 51 of the Disaster Management Act. So this policy interventions do happen. And usually, and unfortunately, we don't see this interventions coming up big out in public domain, discussed by the media, because such rules and acts are very dry for public to read and digest. One of the initiatives that Madam herself had chaired and started was the techno-legal regime amendment of the state. The state's building rules had to be amended to fit to what ARIA committee had recommended way back from the NDMA. This amendment is also taken up in a subtle manner into the KMBR and KPBR, and nobody has discussed it, and nobody does even know that such amendments have come about based on the instructions and deliberations of Disaster Management Authority of the state. Of course, this works need not be kind of trumpeted, but of course, this interventions have happened in the past. Now, there are certain other larger policy level discussions that SDMA triggered in 2018, which Dr. Muralee Thummarukudy also had very vehemently supported, and that is with respect to how we should be having a land use act in the state, and determining how land is utilized in the different geomorphic units of the state, which is very much being discussed. It is part of the Rebuild Kerala development program. It is very highly cited as a requirement in the state to ensure DRR in the state. And that land use act would also require land administration to be looked at from a very technical perspective, unlike looked at from a revenue or recordical perspective. It has to go from a perspective of technicalities. It has to go from a perspective of science, and that is already discussed. Already highland area rules are being discussed in the state. It is already in the making. However, it's long way before an act or a rule is framed and formulated. I think the fastest rule-making process was championed by Dr. Niveditha Haran when she was our boss. That was the River Management Act. I think it took very limited time. Madam brought in a lot of science into it, and it still holds good and goes on as a Bible for river management. But such a rule will be required, such an act will be required for land use, and this we have been campaigning for, and this is already put into the Rebuild Kerala Development Plan. With respect to coordination exercises, our Orange Book is a document, a live document. It gets refined and revised every year since 2019. And this document covers 33 departments and 8 responding forces as to what are their roles, responsibilities, all this enshrined there. And this year in 2020, the entire monsoon season was handled that way. We have incident response system implemented up to taluk level. a lot more training, a continued training is required for people to understand outside the brackets of departments, and that is what we are attempting to do.
Dr. Shekhar, can I ask you? This one question came from the participants to the their benefit. KSDMA in the recent times decided, or this is a question I got from the audience here. The KSDMA's response to cyclone would be based on state's own thumb rule, which is slightly different from the SOP laid out by IMD.
Yes.
And if that being the case, is there any need for a localized SOP and response mechanism for disaster management? Since you mentioned, I know your approach, I just want to clarify for the benefit of the audience.
Yes, it is slightly different from what IMD has proposed, and that is based on our lessons in Cyclone Oki. Because when an advisory is issued to fishermen, we now convert it into no-go. And that is with respect to the stage of a cyclone formation. So if it is already developed into a low pressure, we don't permit our fisher folks to get out into the sea. And there are certain other changes also that we have adopted locally. Yes, local disaster response requires a lot of its own framework in Kerala. And hence, since in 2019, Kerala became the only state in the country to have local self-government DM plans in all local self-governments. And this is an approved plan. All the local self-governments have DM plans now. We have got it formulated through a guideline issued by us and extensive training by Kila. The plans are for the first time made, and of course, therefore, it has its own problems. SDMA provided 33 different layers for every panchayats, geospatial layers for all panchayats, municipalities, and corporations to prepare this. And now we are reviewing all of these plans through a set of experts, and these plans will be made ready to be revised for the next local self-government to come in place. So this process is happening parallelly under the Rebuild Kerala Development Program. And we have technical experts on rural development, urban planning, architecture, hydrology, agriculture, all of it working on this plan making for the local self-governments. So those plans will feed into the district disaster management plans, and the DM plans of the district will pick up those issues that the local self-governments can't handle locally. And therefore, the coordination mechanism is vertically and horizontally linked up. Earlier, it was only vertically down through the revenue system. Now it is a horizontal, wherein the local self-governments have also largely come into place. And we have extensive training programs for them online through Kila, which we host, we support. This is also happening. Yes, it is very much needed that we have a local response plan, and that is the Orange Book. I urge everybody to read that. It is in Malayalam. We have made a English copy, but then it's in Malayalam, which tells what each has to do, including every camp, what every camp has to do. Kerala has 4 types of camps for COVID. So that is how it is planned to the last mile.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Kuriakose. I started taking questions from the audience. The audience can post their questions on our Facebook pages or on the chat box. This is the question from Mr. K.V. Thomas to Dr. Grover. You talked about collection of empirical scientific data and documentation of disaster experience, and memories are vital for disaster management. And he shares his experience, direct experience in Gujarat during the time of Gujarat Earthquake and the perennial floods in Brahmaputra River of Assam. The community or the people in general are averse to follow up the guidelines to avoid these future disasters. How can we tackle those indifferences? Can we learn something from your experience in US?
It's interesting. I just typed a longish response to him, but I'll repeat it here. It's interesting he mentions the Gujarat earthquake because I was also present in Gujarat at that time. And that event basically changed the direction of my profession. At that time, I was director for Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, the Natural Heritage Division. I was in Gujarat doing water resource surveys and water resource planning stuff. And I experienced an earthquake, and then I stayed back to help with relief measures. And then I was asked by one of the UK foundations, to help them prepare plans for redevelopment. And that kind of got me interested in disasters. And I kind of share his frustration that many times, like I was saying, the people have very short memories. They forget what happened in the last disaster. They think of it as an act of, fluke event that happened, and we get a low, and they don't want to, and they just let it go. They do not want to work towards it. Like Dr. Muralee was saying that, it happens, but we don't want to, and we say, oh yeah, well, let's go for it. And then we forget about it in a few months, and then we wait for something else to happen. And I think part of that reason also is because from sociological perspectives, it's easier for us to kind of forget. We want to ignore the risks. As human beings, we tend to be risk averse in the sense that we kind of ignore risks till the time they don't see us on our face. So what we have seen is that knowledge kind of is the key here. If people are aware that their risks are real and can have significant negative impacts on them personally, they will do the logical and the rational thing, is listen to measures. The problem happens is that, unfortunately, whenever such an event occurs, often it is framed as, oh, it's happened because of a natural cause, that it's act of God, we really couldn't do anything about it. So when you are projecting that kind of a lack of control to a human being, he'll be like, oh yeah, I can't do anything about it, so why should I worry? So whatever somebody is telling me to do to avoid the future disaster won't make any difference. So I think education and engaging with the people plays a major role in it, where it can be shown, where if they understand that their small actions can contribute to reduce losses in the future, that'll be really useful. At the same time, I also feel the government has a duty, or rather can play an active role in promoting risk reduction behavior, because they also need to look at it as a profit and loss. In the US now, we have kind of, after major surveys and after costing, like I've talked to you before, we've realized that if you put like $1 in mitigation, you can get 6 to 7 times reduction in actual losses. So if we can start promoting that kind of a risk reduction behavior, it takes a little time. It's a shift in cultural perspective. It's a shift in thinking of disasters as an act of God, or some kind of an extreme natural event, as that the humans themselves are actually causing most of these events. So this combination of community outreach, education, knowledge sharing, along with incentives to do risk reduction measures, I think would certainly promote people. Nobody wants to stand in front of a running bus. If they know that the bus is going to kill them, they will move away. Nobody does that. So
Okay.
that's my opinion on it.
Yeah,
People will
yeah.
do the right thing as long as they have access to the right knowledge and the resources needed to do the right thing.
Niveditha ma'am, question for you from Naveen Tony. So his question is, one of the reasons behind 2018 Kerala flood were land use change. Changes in land use, that is change of vegetation to built up areas, resulted in encroaching of flood waves into floodplain. The land use planning is one of the risk reduction method. Do you think it is possible for Kerala, due to high population density, can we have a regulatory mechanism to see, to ensure that the disasters are kept away while we go for optimization of land use?
Yeah. Yes, that actually this question is linked to Dr. Dhanuraj, your question earlier, which I had failed to answer. My apologies, about land and the impact and the connectivity between land and disasters. A land use policy in Kerala, something exists, but as was mentioned by Dr. Shekhar, and it is correct, a lot of thinking has been going around it, but nothing has come through. However, if we take specific acts, for instance, the Paddy Land Wetland Act, that's also a land use act. It's a kind of land use act where the government regulates which wetlands can be converted or not converted, which paddy land should not be converted into garden land. So it's also a land use act. However, I think it is very important, and this is especially important for present times when the difference between natural disasters and man-made disasters has got extremely blurred. You see, very often when a natural disaster happens, the causes could be very much man-made, and we know it. And therefore, there is a need to have a very clear statute where the use change or the geographical change of a land, converting, for instance, hillocks into plain land, which happens willy-nilly, that should not be permitted. But more important are the water bodies. And I think Dr. Muralee mentioned that. The rivulets, the ponds, the tanks, these are all being encroached and filled up, although there are acts preventing it. So the important point is not just have the act, but the second part of it is even more important, which is enforce the act. Enforcement is a big problem, even in Kerala. More so.
Just to add to that question, in this framework, what do you see the role of, where do you see the role of state government, local governments, communities, civil society organizations in enforcing this? No, I'm sure I'm sure state can enforce definitely, but the participatory role, where it comes.
You see, land is a state subject, and right. Therefore it has to be the acts and the policies have to come from the government, land and water bodies protection. However, when it comes to enforcement, it is true that unless there is awareness amongst the people and the people realize that if I fill up my paddy land, the climate around my area would change. There will be water shortage. There'll be drainage problems from my land in future. I think that kind of personalization of the problem has not happened in Kerala, perhaps. And that is why people fill up their land thinking of a short-term gain, which is again, and that again, it's the market forces. The price of a garden land is much more than that of a paddy land or a wetland. And therefore people try to fill it up, and the disastrous consequences follow. Therefore, I think it is very important that the state, especially in a state like Kerala, where land is so limited, population density is so high, it is very important to ensure that the use of land is regulated and is controlled in a manner that the future generations do not suffer.
Okay. So thank you, ma'am. Next question goes to Dr. Muralee. What can Kerala learn from Amsterdam model of effective flood management? Also, the Japanese have a working underground storage system where flood water is channeled and later treated for public use. Are such infra development suitable for a state like Kerala?
The Netherlands model of flood prevention, what is now globally known as the room for the river approach, is something which the United Nations Environment Program also has been supporting at least for the last 10 years. The idea is very basic and very simple, that, as Dr. Grover mentioned, most disasters happen because our civilization and our activities, infrastructure is encroaching onto where the hazards exist. The hazards were always there. So, as also what Niveditha mentioned, if you fill our paddy field, naturally the water level will rise. And we eliminate these things and allow space for the water to run through in the river by deepening it, by extending it, by creating a buffer zone around it, and so on. So the method is absolutely valuable, especially in places like Kuttanad, for example, where the floods in Kutanad is completely artificially created by our development in the last 200 years. The floods which are now happening in Kochi, and it's going to be of increasing frequency due to climate change in the next 50 years, can never be dealt with an infrastructure development. And, at least a certain part of Kochi will be inhabitable in the next 50 years. So clearly an Amsterdam type approach where they are providing room for the river or making space for water would be the only solution we can have. The infrastructure heavy solution proposed in Tokyo or maintained in Tokyo and also in Malaysia may not be applicable in our case, partly because of the heavy cost involved, partly because of the amount of rainfall we receive in unit time. So I would be looking in that direction for our flooding problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muralee. Next question goes to Dr. Kuriakose. This question from Jerin Varghese. What are the challenges of disaster management implementation in the Kerala context?
I think I already responded to it online.
Okay.
The question is pretty general. The implementation is, the disaster management implementation is not what I think we should be discussing. It's more of how do you get out of these challenges and get a smooth disaster management mainstreaming happen in the state is what we should be discussing. So challenges are there. Madam took the initial challenges. We continued with facing a lot of challenges. We still face, but then the point that we want to make here is that we should be relentless in our approach towards pushing this cause, and that's the only way forward. So like climate change, disaster management is also looked upon when there are disasters and when it strikes. Kerala is actively discussing this with given the number of disasters that it faced, but for that we would still keep it in the backdrop, and then we'll take it up when issues come. So that is the biggest challenge, to mainstream it, to make it everybody's problem, to make it everybody's discussion agenda when they formulate plans and when they take up new projects and developmental projects. That's what is the big challenge. And we are relentless in continuing with our efforts. We will face challenges. We shouldn't be feeling sad about it. There are many challenges, but challenges don't stop anyone. That's what I will assure her.
Thank you, Dr. Kuriakose. Dr. Muralee, can you take one more question before you leave? Yeah, there is one very relevant question by Mr. K.V. Thomas. He is asking about disaster and environment are interrelated. Do you think whether implementation of Gadgil report is a prerequisite to avoid future disasters, especially in the ecologically fragile areas of Western Ghat, including some districts of Kerala? Do you feel that the administrative steps are adequate to deal with the issue? What role the community in these areas can play a constructive role?
Thank you for this very interesting question. I think it has, for the last 3 years, it has become an annual routine that we have a flood or a landslide, and then we have a reference to the Gadgil committee report, as if this report standalone implemented would be a silver bullet to solve all our disaster issues in Kerala. And this is not true. We all agree, and all the panelists have mentioned that good land use planning is fundamental to achieving sustainable disaster risk reduction. And the Gadgil committee report have very good suggestions on it. And certainly it should be implemented. But land use planning is not just limited to the high range. We need Paddy and Wetland Act, as Dr. Niveditha Madam mentioned, is also a land use act that should be implemented in the lowlands, the midlands. And we should also implement all the Coastal Zone Regulation Act, where the Supreme Court has to intervene and dramatically destroy buildings, just probably less than 0.1% of actually the number of buildings which has encroached, just to demonstrate that point. Now the problem so we need comprehensive land use regulation covering the hills, high ranges, midland, lowland, coastal areas. But our problem is that we are always happy to implement measures when it doesn't cost us anything. So people in the midland are very happy to have the Gadgil Commission report implemented in the hill because it doesn't cost them anything. People in the hill are very happy that the Paddy and Wetland Acts are implemented because that doesn't cost them anything. And people in the highland and the midland are very happy to have the coastal zone regulation. When we were watching those buildings coming down, we were saying, yeah, that's exactly the right thing to do, that they should not be violating the rules, while we were very happily violating our own rules in the midlands and highlands. So I will take away this attention from one report and think that as a unique solution for our disaster management problem. We need land use planning, and that will affect everybody. And land has become a commodity of trading, and that go back to its original function as a means of production, means of recreation. And that's when the land price will come down, and that's when we will be able to have sustainable land management in Kerala. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muralee. I think you want to leave. So thank you so much for spending time with us, joining from Geneva, and sharing your global experience and expertise in disaster management and mitigation. Thank you so much, and we look forward to getting your advice in the future also. And also, I am sure this project doesn't come to an end with this discussion or release of this handbook. This is a continuous work, and all of us present here are determined to continue our good work and seeking expert opinion from people like you. So thank you so much. Thank you very much for joining us on this panel.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
So my next question goes to Dr. Shekhar Kuriakose. The question is very simple. This is from Priya Pillai. She's asking whether COVID-19 be considered under disaster management.
Excellent question. Kerala was the first in the country to notify it as a state-specific disaster, and this we did in February when the rest of the country was still thinking of what to do with it. We started modeling the daily numbers, the spatial spread of it since February. That was when we had initially 3 cases in Kerala, and this SDMA was doing right from the beginning. And I think in her question, she was also mentioning about whether we have kind of lost grip of what we were doing in terms of COVID containment, which is not the case. We are well within the predicted numbers. We started in February. In March, we had a very clear SIR model which we developed here in-house. And in that model, we had a certain numbers which were projected. We created a business continuity plan, and what you in the public domain know as COVID frontline treatment centers, where our creation as part of the COVID business continuity plan for the health department of the state, in-house again, developed by the State Disaster Management Authority. So yes, COVID is a disaster. It is a NATEC. It is a disaster which is having kind of cascading consequences on every other disaster that the state is facing. For example, the floods of 2020, we had to create 4 different types of camps to accommodate 4 different classes of people who were COVID affected, partially COVID affected, quarantined, and general. So all this had to be done. And I think the impacts of COVID will continue to be felt on a number of disasters, whether natural or human-made, that are in the making for Kerala in the coming months. So yes, COVID is a disaster. We were the first to notify it formally in the country, and we did it in February. we continue to operate on emergency mode since then, with 24/7 operations from the State Emergency Operations Center.
Thank you. We got one question that could be answered by both Dr. Grover and Dr. Kuriakose. This is about involvement of private players, public-private partnership that we talked a lot. And in fact, Grover, during his presentations, those workshops that we had conducted, we in fact talked about how market also plays a role in some of these initiatives that university has started. And I would also hear from Dr. Kuriakose about his experience. When I talk about private, it's not about civil society organizations and community organizations, real-time market players. So how they are playing a role in Kerala. So starting with Dr. Grover.
Yeah, Dhanuraj, I was reading that question only and I was thinking, what to respond to it, because I mean, one of the things we have to understand that the private players, especially the way I guess the question is asked is profit, the private players whose primary motive is profit making. I do know there are a number of legislations and I guess guidance documents in India that talk about corporate social responsibility and promote socially responsible behavior. So that seems to be one of those easier nexus where you can ask corporates to kind of play a leading role and work with government agencies and the community to reduce their risk exposure. At the same time, there is also this growing field. I don't know if any of you have seen that even in the US, out of our Silicon Valley, now there are 5 or 6 new startups that are talking about disaster apps, disaster preparedness apps. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a lot of profit in actually private players coming into the field and promoting disaster awareness and promoting mitigation and actually working with the community to develop more or to strengthen the existing response systems. So that would be one of the places where private players can kind of work with the government, fill in the gap. Another one is larger, bigger players actually can help the government in terms of generating data sets, sharing their expertise, providing the risk assessment, the risk models, and also, of course, the insurance industry also can play a major role there. So there are a variety of ways and there are a variety of examples available across the world. For example, here, Microsoft and Amazon and all, each one of them have their own risk management divisions, which work with the local government in trying to pass on the information of any kind of impending disaster. Like for wildfires, we have a number of private agencies circulating the warnings, guidance documents, and using their own networks. So think of it this way: if larger corporates can actually have a tie-up with the government, where once a warning is issued, they can kind of through SMS send it to all their employees. That itself serves a big purpose, that a significant proportion of the population gets it. So yeah, so there are a variety of ways to do it. I think it just needs a little bit of innovation and thinking out of the box, and the results can be really good.
Thank you, Thank you, Dr. Grover and Dr. Kuriakose. How are we involving them? What are the plans?
Thank you.
And Kerala is also known for, this question is also very important in the context of Kerala, because we have startup missions. We have so many, there are so many students participating in this program. So what do you like to tell them?
I'll start with our experience much before floods. In 2012, when Madam was our leader, we conducted one of India's largest disaster management conferences called Surakshanam 2012. That is actually what set the ball rolling for creating SDMA as you see it now, which is discussed also. In that conference, from that conference onwards, we have had active participation of private sector. The conference itself received a lot of financial and aid in kind from private sector. We had mobilized over 1.5 crores at that point of time itself for the conduct of a conference in itself. So you can imagine that the private sector of Kerala is very keen to involve with State Disaster Management Authority in various aspects. Of course, given the lack of a framework to engage them, there are issues that we do see. Today also parallelly, I was discussing on the same issue of private sector engagement with the State Planning Board, where we were discussing on how to formulate that. Now, in 2018 floods, the private sector of the state came together under the Council for Industries and benevolently supported the Rebuild Kerala initiative, not just by financial aid, but also bringing in innovative technological solutions. For example, new and alternate types of housing which are less reliant on natural resources for construction, energy efficient lighting. They even supported to the extent of funding of providing entire electrification support to houses across Kerala in many parts. More interestingly, and this is something that I for the first time saw officially recorded anywhere, they instituted a business to government scheme of support. So, for example, when a household has lost all its assets in a natural hazard, like in the 2018 or 19 floods, and they wanted to buy a television or an electric fan or a light, the companies came and said that we will offer it to them in a business to government rate. Thereby, a lot of taxation, a lot of profit got offsetted, and people were able to come up with small amounts of money and procure all those essential items that they lost. To support that, we also facilitated a soft loan through Kudumbashree, our women's self-help group, famous women's self-help group, wherein the families were given about 1 lakh soft loan to procure essential items from notified shops, which agreed for a business to government rate of providing assistance. From the startups, tremendous support. In the beginning days of COVID, I had about 20 startup leaders or the CEOs of startup companies sitting here in the SDMA, crunching data on hospitals. Now, if you go to our infrastructure database, you will see all hospitals, a lot of infrastructure enlisted, mapped and provided as Excel sheets in public domain. All this was done by startups. They're people who came and worked with us. In 2018 floods, we had a startup company working with us on locating people in distress and providing locations based on those distress calls back to the rescue teams. So startup engagement is pretty broad in SDMA. We work on a daily basis with volunteers from the startup companies. They do it voluntarily. Some are paid, some are not paid. Some projects are funded. And recently, with the support of World Bank, we also did a Tech Emerge project. We have just shortlisted a company on data analytics who would be helping us to establish an online platform for big data handling. In the data that we had in 2018 floods and 19 floods are huge, and that data needs to be crunched and brought into one platform. So that is also being supported through young startup companies, private companies. So we are not averse to private companies.
Very encouraging news for all the students attending this panel discussion. With that, we are coming to the end of the panel discussion. Before we leave, I'll request Niveditha ma'am to summarize the discussion and share her thoughts about the future of disaster management in the state of Kerala.
Thank you. I think we had some excellent sharing of ideas and listening to each other. I think the biggest takeaways for me are the first, the importance of ensuring that we are better prepared and ensuring that it doesn't stop with just having our plans and SOPs, but ensuring that they are actually taken down to the grassroots level. Second, we got some excellent ideas that Dr. Professor Grover shared about what is happening in other countries. And I think there is never a time when we should stop learning from others. We don't just learn and copy, but we also adapt, which is extremely important. And in the case of India, that is extremely important also because it's a kind of takeoff from the last question that was there about the involvement of private sector. Since I get this opportunity, let me mention, I am involved with a couple of small and micro enterprises, and I'm mentoring them. And at least 3 of them have, during this pandemic period, have diversified into areas where they are involved in supplies to public health. And you see, that is the way that a startup should function. It should be able to take up things as the situation demands. And that is a lesson that we, I think, are taking away from here. Also, finally, the importance of the local bodies and ensuring that we encourage them to innovate, to come up with ideas which are local specific is again so important. And in that context, I have to end by saying that protecting our lands, protecting our water bodies are so very important, especially if we want to ensure in a state like Kerala that we are more resilient to our floods and we are able to face them in a manner that will lead to lesser loss to life and property, which is extremely important because every life lost is a disaster, is a shame, which should not happen. And I think that is the main takeaways that I take away from here, Professor Dhanuraj. And finally, thank you for having me.
Thank you, ma'am. I think with that note, every life lost is a disaster. It's a shame. I think we should work together towards reducing the risks and also the loss of lives in our times. This is a very wonderful panel discussion. Thank you so much for participating in this panel discussion. Thank you so much, Niveditha, ma'am. You took time to actively involve in this panel discussion. Dr. Grover is late night there, and then you are so happy to join and share your thoughts. Dr. Kuriakose, I know you. It's a very, I always wonder, how do you find time for all these meetings? Because I think Kerala is facing disasters or all some, emergencies every day. So you are responsible for, decision making and active involvement in all the bureaucratic decisions or political leadership decisions that is taken. Thank you so much. With this, I'm sorry that I couldn't take all the questions. There are so many questions. In fact, the chat box is flooded with questions for the paucity of the time. But we will continue this conversation on our Facebook page. Thank you so much. And with that, I hand over the proceedings, rest of the meeting proceedings to Maulik. Maulik?
Well, thank you, Dr. Dhanuraj. Thank you for leading that panel discussion and for all the question and answers. I want to thank your team at the Center for Public Policy Research who worked so hard with my colleagues on this project. We really enjoyed it. And like I said in the beginning, this is a day of culmination with the release of the handbook. So congratulations, a job well done. I want to give a quick shout out to my colleagues on the digital team at the Consulate. They work very hard behind the scenes to make this program and many others in this virtual time a success. So I want to in particular thank my colleagues at the Consulate for their hard work on our digital program.
Hello, are we missing link? Maulik?
Yeah, we lost Maulik.
Okay.
I'm happy to from the Consulate if that's what's needed. I echo Maulik's thanks to all of you, especially those who joined us from different countries and different time zones. It's been a wonderful discussion, and as you have seen in the chat box, all these discussions are captured both on Facebook and our YouTube channel. So thank you very much.
And my colleague Neetu Nair will extend a lot of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. The current pandemic that is raging across the world is yet another reminder that we need to seriously intensify the commitment on disaster management and preparedness, and also work towards an all hazards approach. So on behalf of the Center for Public Policy Research and the US Consulate General in Chennai, let me take this opportunity to thank all the speakers who shared their experience and expertise here today. Thank you, Ms. Lee Sashadry, Public Affairs Officer, US Consulate General, for releasing the Community Resilience Handbook and enlightening the audience with the highs and lows of the America with Kerala project. Thank you. This particular handbook is available on CPPR's website now, and also the link has been shared on the chat box, so you can download it there. Also, Dr. Muralee Thummarukudy, Chief of Disaster Risk Reduction at the United Nations Environment Program. Thank you, sir, for sharing the international and local experience of disaster management, as well as the need for an all hazards approach, not just focus on the last disaster. So, and more importantly, thank you for repeatedly stressing on the need for the diversity in this panel. Thank you, Dr. Niveditha Haran, who's a retired IAS officer, former Additional Chief Secretary, Department of Home Affairs, and currently the chairperson of the Board of Directors at Center for Migration and Inclusive Development. Thank you for such an interesting articulation of the experience of working within the government system in building up a community resilience. Also, your observations on the involvement of women leaders comes as a very crucial point in this discussion. Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Shekhar Kuriakose, Member Secretary, Kerala State Disaster Management Authority. Both KSDMA and Dr. Shekhar has been a guiding force for the entire America with Kerala project. Thank you, sir, not only for sharing your experience today, but also for your guidance over the entire course of last year, without which a discussion for us on the disaster management landscape in Kerala would not have been complete. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Dr. Himanshu Grover, Co-Director, Institute for Hazard Mitigation and Planning, University of Washington, Seattle. Right from the first workshop in Trivandrum in June 2019 till today, your expertise has added immense value to this project. I remember how clearly and how patiently you explained the disaster management cycle and the all hazards approach to a wide variety of audiences. So we are immensely grateful for your support, sir. I also extend my gratitude to Dr. Dhanuraj, who moderated this session and brought together perspectives in these different perspectives in a meaningful way. So he has been a guiding force and a mentor to the CPPR team who is working on the project. So throughout the America with Kerala project, we had the support of many organizations and academic institutions who partnered with us to make this a grand success. Many of them are here with us today. Various departments of the Kerala government, the Kudumbashree Mission, ASAP, district administrations of Trivandrum, Kochi, and Kozhikode, Chamber of Commerce in Kochi and Calicut, civil society organizations like Tunnel Palliative Care, Pratidwani, and most importantly, academic institutions like the JDT Islam Group of Institutions, St. Teresa's College, Kochi, Kerala University, Bharat Mata College, and various media houses. We thank each of you for your immense support throughout the America with Kerala project. Also, I extend my warm gratitude to Mr. Maulik Barkana, Cultural Affairs Officer, US Consulate General, and Lauren Lovelace from the Consulate. They have been a constant source of encouragement for each of our team members working behind the scenes for this project. Also, at this juncture, I cannot thank enough the US Consulate team who has worked with us, Viju, Ratna, Chitra, Venkatesh, Nelson, Deepthi, Suman. I'm taking out these names because we've had so many individual interactions with you, and each of them have been a personal learning experience for all of us. Last but not the least, I thank our team at CPPR who has stood behind the scenes, contributing brick by brick to this project. So if we have taken a step towards creating a more resilient community, it is all these efforts put together. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience and engaging so well during this conversation. Thank you and have a good day.